Welcome to the first Hive Mind Talks. The Hive Mind is a repository of go-to-market information for SaaS businesses and fintechs. In the first episode, we're going to be doing a series of content which specializes in one subject for sales and marketing. One of the things fintechs choose to do to connect with their audience is to start a podcast. Now, we have a very special guest here today. We have Dharm from Dharm and Dave's Demystify, one of the most successful fintech podcasts out there. There are in excess of 94 episodes and 300,000 views so far. And Dharm has been kind enough to give us his time to give some hot tips on how people can launch their podcast and the lessons that he's learned along the way. Dharm, thank you very much for joining us.
Oh, it's a real pleasure to be on the show. Sorry, James, I do have to correct you because we have done pretty well, but it was 30,000.
Only 30,000, Dharm. Yeah, still very impressive.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. So, I mean, it would be great if you could start us off by telling us a little bit about how you came to launch the podcast in the first place. Can you tell us about that?
Dave and I go back a long way. That was the first thing, So we've worked together since the beginning of the .com, and we live near each other. So we were walking the dogs, and I got Dave involved in writing for Fintech Futures. And at the same time, we were kind of thinking, like, where do we go from here? Like, now we're both doing an article, alternatively, a week for Fintech Futures. As many other people, I started listening to podcasts, and I said, why don't we do a podcast? And it was very much an experiment to start off with it anyway, right? And what we discussed was, isn't this industry just full of bloody jargon, right? And everyone talks in this like terminology, and nobody speaks in proper English. So the whole idea of Dave and Dharm Demystify was two things, really. One was to take the terminology and just simply demystify it, right? And then secondly, it was to give a perspective that was kind of business and marketing orientated, which is kind of Dave's background, right? He comes from an agency background. And then also to take the kind of technology view of it, which was my background, right? Both of us worked in financial services. We kind of felt that it's good to focus in on an area that we know well. And we also knew that at some point when we're bringing on guests, we've got a really good network within financial services to bring on some compelling guests.
Great. So was the genesis kind of driven purely from a passion perspective, or was there something that, beyond tackling that niche subject that you wanted to achieve from it? I mean, did you have any idea that you'd still be going after 94 episodes?
No, I mean, we didn't realize it would get as successful as it was, is the honest truth. It was really, like I said, initially it was very much an experiment for us to, see what it was like to host and run a podcast, right? But very quickly it became part of our overall kind of brand awareness strategy and, getting connected back to the network. Because, like maybe 10 years ago, the 30% of people might have listened to a podcast, right? Today, that's like 60%. So, writing articles was one, stream of generating content. But, I'm a big fan of bank strategies, etc. And one of the things that Dave and I both talk about is engagement. And, being not employed anymore, I guess, as a contractor, we were looking at how do we stay engaged with the rest of the community? We don't necessarily need to be doing business with lots and lots of companies, but how do we stay connected to the network and provide some value back, right? And podcasts and articles are just part of an overall strategy for driving engagement with this community, right? And putting some value back, right? We had some fantastic experience. We wanted to share it. And when we also look at our network and we think, well, actually, in our network, we've got some amazing people that have done some amazing stuff. We should give them a platform too. So that's really, how it's all come about.
So from a brand perspective, I think from a sales and marketing side, that's really interesting because it kind of alludes to, beyond just kind of raw lead generation, the importance of being credible and having a voice in terms of building and maintaining a brand. Like, how would you encourage, like, if there's a business that's looking to launch a podcast for commercial reasons, how would you encourage them to look on the ROI, over time?
Yeah, I mean, you've got to think about this thing as not just having we describe our show as a casual conversation, about fintech and technology and financial services, right? But actually what we're doing is trying to provide some valuable content, some level of entertainment, right? Because, at the end of the day, you want people to come back and listen to the next episode, right? Or at least, future episodes, etc. So there has to be something there that makes it interesting for people to come back. So, my advice to companies that want to go down this route, right, is this isn't your product pitch. This isn't a weekly show on the features and benefits of product X, why it's so good, why, every financial services company needs it, what makes yours better. It's not that. What it is you take a topic and you provide thought leadership on it. You provide some different views on it. You get some right-angled things to maybe, counter some of the things that you're saying, right, as a company, right? But it has to be something that's not really about your product. Nobody signs up to a podcast just to listen to the adverts, right?
Yeah, not for very long. I think you tune out immediately as soon as it's clear there's this kind of obvious. It's a platform to cram the product down your throat.
No, exactly. I mean, look, we have a number of companies on our show, and what we're trying to do is open up these companies so that people can get to know them, why they started, what is it about them that makes them different, etc. So that they don't have to turn up and, what they're really going to get is 1 second on, what's the company and then the rest on the product. This is really about getting to know somebody or a company internally without the sales pitch, right?
Yeah. So you would say, in terms of, if we called it a step one, the first thing that you need to do is figure out how you're providing kind of a non-you centric value back to them in terms of something that's either entertaining or educational. Like that's where they should start.
Yeah, and look, I mean, I think, companies that have been on our show, and we don't charge anybody to come on our show. It's not a revenue making platform for us, right? So, companies may use our show in a number of ways. They'll promote it to their clients. They'll promote it to their, prospects. They may use it almost like collateral. Oh, by the way, we discussed this aspect in our show. Here's the link to the show, etc. So I think you can, like with any content, you can use it in a multitude of ways. And, whether you run your own podcast or you get featured on somebody else's like ours, it's valuable content. It should be part of the mix, right? You want not just text. You don't want to be just cramming white papers and blog posts and tweets, etc. Not everyone wants to, sit and read a big document. What we found is that with podcasts, people will listen in, and we found that the sweet spot is about 30 minutes, right? So, it's typically something that people will listen to on the way into work, at lunchtime, or the way home, right? If it's me, I can afford a bit longer because I tend to do my longer runs at the weekend, and I listen to a podcast while I'm running.
I think that's a really good point, Dom. Like keep it punchy rather than trying to deliver War and Peace in every episode.
Yeah, it's exactly what people want to hear, right? I mean, I think the nice thing about podcasts is that you shouldn't really, if you're the host, you shouldn't give questions out too soon, and certainly you should have your own that you haven't discussed before as well, because it's what makes the show. It's unvetted. It should feel unvetted. should feel a bit off the cuff. You know, yes, there's going to be some mistakes. We had one right at the beginning, right? But that's all natural part of the show, right? That's all natural, right? Everyone makes mistakes. We want to sometimes hear them. It makes it a bit more real about, you know, what the show's about.
Yeah. And when you first started, I mean, obviously you got up to 30,000. I got it right that time,
Yeah.
and you know, about up to 500 listeners in each episode. How did that start? I mean, did you kind of get to that sort of audience very quickly, or you know, for the first five, was it crickets? I mean, one of the things that I read as a statistic is most podcasts don't go beyond 8 episodes, so people start and you know it doesn't deliver immediate value and they completely give up. Like, what was it like at the very beginning?
This is an ultra marathon. It's never a sprint, right? And if you're a company and you think that, you know, doing a 5 series episode, you know, like a podcast is going to get you some value, you think again. You might as well not start necessarily, right? The thing that if you want the traction, you have to put in the mileage, which means that, you know, whatever the listenership, you just keep plowing on, right? And what you do is use the listenership to kind of help you direct and refine the show, right? So, you know, we found early on that, I mean, we started off just Dave and I having a conversation around specific topics. Then we started to bring some guests on. Then we found like certain guests, you know, certain types of areas were more interesting and were driving a higher listenership, right? Sometimes we were finding just like some guests for the topic that they were discussing, they weren't a well-known person. And we've had literally the who's who of fintech on our show. You know, we've had all of the finfluencers, we've had CEOs of banks, etc., etc. But sometimes it's a small fintech with a really interesting story, right? Like the guy that, you know, came onto our show and talked about how he was using AI to understand dementia and then provide them, those kind of people, with financial advice, right? So, you know,
Wow.
there's some things that, you know, just catch people's interest and you get massive listenership. But the answer, as always, is in the data, right? So, you know, you publish an episode and it may not be even the recording that was potentially the thing that didn't drive the listenership. It may have been the promotion, because remember, you know, there's the show and then how you tell people about the show, right? And, you know, we started off typically post it and that's that, and give it a rough description. Then we started to work out, well, okay, the description needs to have some more tags. It needs to have some people brought into it. It needs to have a bit of a description and tell people what they're going to walk away with from listening to this show, right? We've now started to doing like short video kind of promo clips almost, you know, this kind of the catchphrases that, you know, we can, oh yeah, that was a really great way of describing that. You show that, you know.
Yeah.
So yes, it's very much like, you know, almost a TV program where you've got to think not only about the program but the adverts for the program as well.
Fantastic. I particularly like your advice back there around the duration, referring to it as a marathon. And I think from a sales and marketing perspective, that's kind of particularly poignant because we live in an instant world where, you know, we're all hooked on, you know, paid media advertising, which is incredibly expensive. And, you know, podcasts in comparison are quite hard to measure and have a kind of a longer lead in, but you know, is so much more effective for genuinely connecting. So I love the fact that you've kind of framed it as something that you need to really commit to. And in terms of like how you started in terms of tooling, are you one of those, you know, do-it-yourself teams? Do you and Dave like sit there with the waveform editor, kind of cutting out all of the bloopers, or do you just send it off to like a production company and you know you're just the stars? You guys arrive in your limos, you know, you record the session and then off you go. How do you produce it?
All of the above. I mean, at the beginning, we first started off literally just recording onto a wave machine. And publishing it, and then we involved a production company that, topped and tailed it with music and intros, balanced the sound quality. That's really important, right? And now we record the show on a platform, and there's loads of good ones out there. I mean, you're using Riverside, we use Riverside. What's great about it is that sometimes you can get some issues with kind of bandwidth. I get it all the time, but it records locally and therefore uploads in the background so that it then stitches it all together at the end of the show, right? And it evens out the sound. It even generates your promo clips. It generates a high-level structure to the show. These things are getting cleverer and cleverer, right? But you still want some production in there to kind of edit out any mistakes or any big pauses, etc. You still want production to add the promo bits at the beginning and at the end, etc.
So if I had to say, look, the beginners podcast, Dharm's tool bag, like what are the things that you would say are kind of really necessary? I mean, I think you just said sound was really important, and we've talked about the editing software, so we're both using Riverside. Like, what are like the 5 must-have bits of kit, either software or hardware, that you would recommend?
Depending on how professional you want to go. I mean, you literally can go with a laptop and a platform like Riverside, so a podcasting platform, right? The platform itself will do a lot of work for you. I happen to use an external mic because it gives slightly better quality. I know lots of people that have higher end mics than I do, but I mean mine serves my need, I think. You've got a fantastic neon light at the back, and there are people that invest in their background. I haven't done that yet.
I'll be honest, that is the result of telling a 44-year-old man there's a way he can have a neon sign in his room and it be tax deductible. That's the only reason.
Oh, I love it though. It looks good.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I think having a nice background, quite possibly, I've managed to get away with it so far. I would take, not necessarily in terms of tooling, but I would definitely have a little bit of production to top and tail the episodes, just to have a bit of intro music, maybe your generic kind of, this is what the podcast is about. Because remember, you're not going to get the same, 300 to 500 listeners every show. You're going to get a variety of different listeners. So you need to remind them that this is what the show is about, in the hope that they not only listen to that one, but then they go on to others, right?
Yeah.
And I think, sometimes it's good to have something at the end where you can kind of summarize it if you want to, depending on what your purpose of your show is.
Yeah. Do you kind of slice it up? I think you kind of talked about maybe starting to do this. Do you kind of distribute clips on different channels? I think one of the things I saw Stephen Bartlett do from his kind of massively famous CEO podcast is he kind of throws out a fragment onto LinkedIn and then he's trying to draw you into the main episode.
I mean, we do it, like I said, the sound bites are really good when you can post those on LinkedIn because, I think what's kind of interesting is that people are drawn not only to the words, but a lot of people are drawn to the pictures. And so if you see a bit of video that looks kind of interesting, people will listen in on it. Or if you see, somebody's specific face, like if it's a popular guest, they'll draw to it. So having that mix of media on the promos is kind of interesting and useful. But yeah, we do the kind of the shortcuts. And again, the platforms these days do so much. Like Riverside will not only help you with the editing, it will actually normalize the sound. It will actually generate the content structure. So it will say, oh, look, here's the intro. The first section talks about banking as a service. The third section talks about the benefits of banking as a service, etc. All of that you can use in the content to kind of, like when you post it, it will generate your magic clips, which are,
the AI transcription. I mean, I know it. I know kind of the world's gone AI crazy, but I have to say that's pretty clever.
I think it's good, cool. And then obviously, right at the end, you get to upload it. So once you've got your account set up on the podcasting platforms, you can just hit one button and it will publish it to those platforms. That's kind
Yeah.
of neat.
Yeah, very, very, very clever, and lots of features coming out like that. So, in terms of guests, I mean, obviously, you can't have a podcast without a guest, and I think you said at the beginning that you were quite well connected through FinTech Futures, and it was more of a way of kind of staying in contact with that community. Like, what advice would you give in terms of identifying and reaching out to those guests? I mean, not everyone is blessed with the same network. So, should people be, firing cold LinkedIn emails saying, be on my podcast? Like, is there a particular way that you would recommend identifying potential guests and, and reaching out to them?
Whoa. It very much depends on the individual and the show itself, right? And I think there has to be a quid pro quo, right? Like, what's in it for the other person to come onto your show, especially like if you're trying to get, I don't know, Lady Glyptis, right? Key influencer, she's a busy lady. Why should she come on our show, right? And the answer is, well, maybe she's launching a new book. She gets to talk about a hot topic, which is a FinTech Futures articles every week, etc., etc. So, it's a bit of promo for her, maybe, right? Is partly the answer. If it's to do with a company, then clearly it's about, what the company is doing, achieving, etc., right? But for something that is a draw for that person, I think, shows that you're not just there to kind of leverage them, but to give them an opportunity to kind of, promote whatever that is important to them at the time. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it may not be, we've got a special guest being lined up for the summer. She was the CEO of a big startup bank, but the topic's not going to be about the bank. It's going to be about, things that are important to her, like women, leadership, etc. Right?
Yeah. And I suppose kind of just towards wrapping us up, like one of the things I always take away from your experiences, you learn lots of lessons, but you acquire lots of scar tissue. So, what lessons can you share with us to save our audience getting the scar tissue? Like, what were the main, like, 3 howling mistakes that if you look back in time, you think, oh God, I would save someone from falling in that hole?
Right. Don't over prepare is the first one, and I kind of alluded to that already, which is, don't try to script all of your answers, all of your questions, etc. Try and, like, what you want is both parties kind of really listening and answering. And it sounds obvious, right? But quite often what you get is like, I didn't even ask that question because I gave a list of questions in advance. They've literally answered the question.
Yeah.
Like,
They're on
that wasn't the
autopilot.
question they asked, right? So, and what you don't want is somebody that's listening in, like, hearing a script being read out, right? So it's very much like if you've ever done any PR and you've been interviewed by a journalist, right? The journalist might say that the topic we're talking about is banking as a service, right? But they'll never give you the question. And even when they're recording, right, the interview, I mean, I've done loads on TV. Every single time they ask the question, they've asked it in a different way. And they purposely do that to get a gut feel kind of conversation, nothing too prescripted out. So that would be my first and biggest tip is, make sure that you have, the only thing that you do in prep is know how to keep asking questions and how to delve in a little bit deeper, etc. Think dynamically about how to drive the conversation in an interesting way for your listener, right? The other thing I'd say is make sure that your environment is set up correctly. I mean, some of the early shows, yes, there was a lot of noise in the background because I hadn't, factored in that, I'm going to get delivery, my dog's going to start barking, etc. Stuff like that.
I was dreading that, Dom, actually. Like, the Amazon man seems to come 6 times a day for me, but thankfully we haven't been interrupted so far.
I mean, that's one of the lucky things of having, like, 2 hosts is that I've been recording a podcast and watched Dave leave the podcast, come back and he's taken delivery of some fresh fruit and veg or something.
He's got the Amazon branded box in the hand.
Yeah. And then I guess, mistakes, I think, other things that we did wrong. I don't know whether, I don't know. I don't tend to dwell on mistakes as such, so I can't really reel them off the top of my head. All I would say is that you're never going to be perfect straight off. So actually having the first few episodes just me and Dave allowed us to almost get into a rhythm and a practice, right? And like with all things, if you've then got a routine, like you literally got your desk ready, you've got your mic ready, you tested the bandwidth, you've checked with your guest how to pronounce their name, and those are the basics, right? And then you just carry on, do your show.
I hadn't thought about that, but actually the co-presenter, I can imagine being, a great asset because it provides you a little bit more breathing space to actually think rather than kind of being on edge kind of moment to moment. So, having your partner in crime in Dave, I think, I can see how that could be a huge help.
I mean, it's good, but I've worked with Dave for so long that we kind of sync up fairly well. But sometimes you find yourself like both wanting to ask questions at the same time.
Yeah.
But we worked out now, it's like, well, hold on, I'll just hold back. Dave's in the middle of something here, right? So you've got to have that kind of relationship with it. And I guess, the other piece of advice I would say is that maximum 4 people on a podcast, no more than that, because then it gets a bit, it's like really difficult to engage everybody.
Becomes a recording of a round table.
Yes, exactly.
One thing I was thinking, actually, in terms of the host, how important, like if this is being run by, for a company, how important that it is that it's kind of led by the founder versus an employee? Like, do you think that's a must, or should they pick the most charismatic person? Like, what do you think to that?
That's a really good question. I think what you want to do is have somebody on the show that embodies the culture of the company. This is you advertising what the company's about almost, right? Or how it is to work with them, etc., right? So I think you do want to have somebody that embodies what the company culture is like and what it's like to deal with them, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be the founder. Could be anyone else. But if it is the founder, I think one of the things, the feedback that we got about the Dave and Dharm is that people love, like we always give examples of things that we've done in the past, whether it was right or wrong. We've shown that we're not in it for fintech in the last 5 years. We've got some track record on some of this stuff, so we bring out some stuff some skeletons from the closet along the way, and you'll get that out of somebody that's been in the company a long time. It generally is the founder, but it could be somebody else.
Yeah, so you can't just, push some 25-year-old media chap that's been with the company for 3 months into the hosting role. Like, it needs to be credible and authentic is what I'm hearing.
I think so. I think especially if it's for a company.
Dom, we're just about out of time. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Thank you for being the first guest on HiveMind, and learnt loads.
Oh, it was a pleasure, and as a podcast host, it's been a really enjoyable conversation, and I wish you all the best for the show. I think it's a really good idea.
Thank you, Dom. Cheers.